He thought her voice was something to laugh at, but he had no idea who was listening. The restaurant glowed in warm amber light, crystal glasses catching reflections from chandeliers that hung like quiet witnesses above polished marble floors. And in the center of it all stood Nia Brooks, her hands trembling slightly as she held a notepad against her apron, her voice soft but steady as she repeated an order she had already said twice. Yet the manager, Charles Bennett, leaned against the counter with a smirk that didn't belong in a place this refined, his laughter sharp as he interrupted her mid-sentence, mimicking her tone, exaggerating every syllable until nearby tables began to notice, then to watch, then to laugh, the sound spreading like a ripple through the room, subtle at first, then undeniable, and Nia felt it all without lifting her eyes, felt the weight of it pressing against her chest as she swallowed hard and tried again. Grilled salmon. No butter, side of, but Charles cut her off once more, louder this time, repeating her words in a distorted echo that drew a few louder chuckles, and someone whispered something under their breath that made another person snort into their drink, and still she stood there, shoulders straight, dignity held together by nothing but will, because this job wasn't just a paycheck, it was rent, it was her mother's medication, it was everything she couldn't afford to lose, so she stayed quiet, even when her voice began to shake, even when her fingers tightened around the pen, even when the room felt too big and too small at the same time. And Charles leaned in just a little closer, lowering his voice but not enough to hide the edge. "You might want to fix that voice if you expect people to take you seriously," he said. And for a second, just a second, Nia's breath caught, her eyes blinking rapidly as she forced herself not to react, not to give him the satisfaction, not to let the room see her break. But what she didn't see, what no one seemed to notice, was the man seated in the far corner of the dining room, dressed in a dark tailored suit that blended into the shadows of the booth, his posture still, his gaze quiet but unyielding, a glass of untouched whiskey resting in his hand as his eyes lifted slowly toward the scene unfolding across the room. And while others heard laughter, he heard every word, every tone, every pause, and something in his expression changed, almost imperceptible, like a shift in air before a storm, his fingers tightening slightly around the glass, his jaw setting just enough to betray the calm he carried so effortlessly. And though no one had addressed him, though no one had invited his attention, Alexander Romano was no longer just another guest in the room, because the moment Charles opened his mouth again, ready to mock her one more time, the faint scrape of a chair against marble cut through the laughter like a blade through silk. And suddenly, the room began to fall silent. The sound of that chair did not belong in a place like this, and yet it cut through the air with a precision that made every conversation falter mid-word, every fork pause halfway to a plate, every eye slowly turned toward the man who had just stood up, and Alexander Romano did not raise his voice, did not rush, did not need to, because presence like his did not ask for attention, it commanded it without effort. His polished shoes stepping across the marble floor with measured calm as he moved closer, each step deliberate, each second stretching longer than the last, until he stopped just a few feet away from Nia and Charles, his gaze settling not on the trembling waitress, but on the man who had been laughing moments before. And suddenly Charles was not leaning anymore, not smiling, not performing, because something in that silence pressed against him in a way he could not explain. "You seem to have a lot to say," Alexander said, his voice low, even, controlled, the kind of voice that did not need volume to carry weight. And for a brief second, Charles tried to recover, forcing out a small laugh as if this were still his stage. "Just trying to keep things professional," he replied, though the words landed weak, uncertain, as if they did not quite belong to him anymore. And Alexander tilted his head slightly, as though considering that answer, as though giving it more patience than it deserved, before his eyes shifted, just once, toward Nia, taking in the way her fingers curled tightly around her notepad, the way her shoulders held themselves upright despite everything, the way her voice, though shaken, had not disappeared, and when he spoke again, it was softer, but somehow heavier. "I would like to hear the order," he said, and it took a second for the room to understand what he meant, for the words to settle into place, and Nia blinked, caught off guard, her breath uneven as she looked up for the first time, meeting his gaze only briefly before instinct pulled her eyes back down. "Yes, sir," she managed, her voice quiet, but present, and she began again, slower this time, careful, each word placed with intention as if rebuilding something that had just been broken. "Grilled salmon, no butter, side of asparagus, and a sparkling water." And the room listened, truly listened, because there was no laughter now, no interruptions, only the steady rhythm of her voice filling the space that had once been filled with mockery. And when she finished, there was a moment, just a moment, where nothing moved, where even the air seemed to hold still, and Alexander gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, as if confirming something only he understood, before his attention returned to Charles, who now stood stiff, uncertain, caught between the urge to speak and the fear of doing so. And Alexander's expression did not change, but his next words landed with quiet finality. "Now you," he said, gesturing lightly. "Say it the way you said it before." And Charles opened his mouth, then hesitated, the memory of his own mockery now sitting heavy on his tongue. And for the first time, he realized that repeating it was no longer amusing, no longer harmless. It was something else entirely, something exposed, something undeniable, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full of every word that had been spoken moments ago, now turned back on him, waiting. Charles felt the weight of every eye in the room settle onto him, not with laughter this time, but with expectation, and it was heavier than anything he had carried before, his throat tightening as he forced a smile that no longer convinced anyone, his fingers twitching at his sides as if searching for the confidence he had worn so easily just moments ago. But it was gone, stripped away by the stillness that Alexander Romano had brought into the space. And for a brief second, Charles tried to speak, tried to recreate the mocking tone that had drawn laughter before, but the words did not come out the same. They hesitated, fractured, lost somewhere between intention and reality. I was just, he began, but even he could hear it, the weakness, the absence of control, and Alexander did not interrupt, did not rush him. He simply stood there, watching, allowing the silence to stretch until it became unbearable, until Charles was forced to confront not just the room, but himself. And behind them, Nia stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind racing as she tried to understand what was happening. Because moments ago she had been invisible, just another voice dismissed, another presence overlooked, and now the entire room seemed to revolve around the very thing she had been told was not enough, her voice. And she could feel it, the shift, subtle but undeniable, like something fragile being placed back where it belonged, carefully, deliberately. And Alexander's gaze remained steady as he spoke again, softer now, but sharper in its meaning. "It is interesting," he said, "how something sounds different when you are the one being asked to repeat it." And the words settled over the room like a quiet verdict, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. And Charles swallowed hard, his posture shrinking just slightly as he realized there was no way to turn this back into a joke, no way to escape the reflection being held up in front of him. And somewhere in the room, a glass was set down gently, the faint clink echoing louder than it should have, because no one else dared to make a sound. No one wanted to break the moment, and Nia's hands loosened just a fraction around her notepad, her shoulders easing in a way she did not fully understand, because for the first time that night, she was not bracing herself for another remark, another laugh, another dismissal. She was simply standing there, being heard, and Alexander turned slightly toward her, not fully, just enough to acknowledge her presence without putting her on display, his voice lowering in a way that felt almost private despite the crowd. "You did your job," he said, and it was not praise, not exaggerated, just a statement of fact, but it carried more weight than anything she had heard all evening. And then he looked back at Charles, his expression unchanged. "Now you will do yours," he added. And there was no threat in the words, no raised tone, but something in the way they were delivered made it clear that this was not a suggestion, not a negotiation. It was a line being drawn, quietly, firmly, and Charles nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if eager to comply, eager to move past the moment, to fix what had just been exposed. But the room did not forget. The air still held the echo of what had happened, and as Nia stepped back, her voice no longer needed to prove anything. 1. Truth remained, unspoken but undeniable, that sometimes the loudest lesson was delivered in silence, and once heard, it could not be unheard. The tension did not break when Charles nodded. It only shifted, settling into something quieter, something heavier, like a truth that had already been spoken and could not be taken back. And as he turned slightly, forcing his attention toward the nearest table, his movements were careful now, measured in a way that revealed just how aware he had become of every pair of eyes still watching him. Because the room had not returned to normal. Not yet. Conversations had not resumed. Laughter had not returned. It lingered in that fragile space between what had happened and what it meant, and Nia stood there for a second longer than she should have, her mind catching up to the moment, her chest rising and falling more steadily now as she slowly stepped aside, giving space, not out of fear this time, but out of something else, something closer to understanding. And behind her, a couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, not mocking, not amused, but thoughtful, as if reconsidering something they had accepted too easily just minutes ago. And at the center of it all, Alexander Romano remained exactly where he stood, his posture unchanged, his presence still anchoring the room, not demanding attention, but holding it effortlessly. And when he finally moved, it was not with urgency, not with display, but with quiet finality. He turned back toward his table, each step as controlled as the ones that had brought him there, as if nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be explained, because the moment had already delivered its meaning. And as he reached his seat, he did not immediately sit. Instead, his hand rested lightly on the back of the chair, his gaze lifting just once more, scanning the room, not in dominance, but in awareness, as if ensuring that what had been said without words had been understood. And slowly, almost cautiously, the restaurant began to breathe again. A fork touched a plate, a whisper resumed, a glass was lifted, but the energy had changed. It no longer carried the careless ease it had before. It carried something more deliberate, more aware, and Nia felt it as she moved back toward the service station, her steps steady, her shoulders no longer drawn inward, her hands no longer trembling the same way. And when she picked up the next order, her voice, though still soft, held something new, not louder, not forced, but grounded, as if it no longer needed permission to exist. And Charles, now behind the counter, avoided looking in her direction, his focus fixed intensely on tasks that had never required such concentration before, because there are moments that do not need consequences to leave an impact, moments that reshape the space around them simply by revealing what was always there. And as Alexander finally took his seat, lifting his glass with the same calm precision, he did not look toward Nia again. He did not need to, because the shift had already taken place, quietly, completely. And for the first time that night, the room understood something it had ignored before, that respect was not given by volume, not earned by imitation, but recognized in the moments when someone chose to listen. And in that understanding, something settled, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently, like a line that once seen could never be unseen. The night did not return to what it had been, not completely, because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, something that could not be undone. And as orders continued and plates moved in and out of the kitchen, there was a new awareness threaded through every interaction, subtle but undeniable. And Nia felt it most in the way people now looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, as if seeing her for the first time. And when she approached a table, there was no hesitation in her voice, no second guessing in the way she spoke, just clarity, steady and grounded. And a woman seated near the window gave her a small, respectful nod after placing an order, a gesture so simple it might have gone unnoticed before, but now it carried weight, because it reflected something that had changed not just in the room, but in the people within it. And behind the counter, Charles moved carefully, his usual confidence replaced with a quiet efficiency, his tone measured, his words chosen with care, as if each sentence now required consideration. And though he never directly addressed what had happened, the absence of his earlier behavior spoke louder than any apology could have. And at the far end of the restaurant, Alexander Romano remained seated, his presence no longer the center of attention, yet still felt in the way the room carried itself, in the way conversation stayed softer, more intentional, and as he lifted his glass, the ice shifting gently with a soft clink, his gaze rested briefly on the reflection in the polished surface of the table, not searching, not evaluating, simply observing, because the moment had already done what it needed to do. And across the room, Nia paused for just a second as she placed a dish down, her hand steady, her movements fluid, and for the first time since she had started working there, she allowed herself to breathe without bracing, without preparing for the next remark, the next correction, the next dismissal. And it was in that quiet second that something settled inside her, not loud, not overwhelming, but certain, like a truth finally recognized. That her voice had never been something to hide, never something to fix. It had always been enough. And as she turned to step away, a coworker who had remained silent earlier caught her eye and gave a small, almost hesitant smile, one that carried understanding rather than judgment. And Nia returned it, just slightly, not out of obligation, but out of acknowledgement. Because sometimes change does not arrive with grand gestures or dramatic declarations. Sometimes it arrives in the absence of what once was, in the silence where laughter used to be, in the respect where there had been none. And as the evening continued, the restaurant moved forward, but it did not forget. It could not forget, because moments like that leave a mark that does not fade with time. And when Alexander finally stood to leave, placing a few bills neatly on the table, his movements as composed as ever, he did not look around for recognition, did not wait for thanks. He simply adjusted his jacket and walked toward the exit, passing by Nia without stopping, without speaking. But as he did, he gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, a gesture so small it could have been missed by anyone not paying attention, yet it carried more meaning than words ever could, and Nia understood it, not as approval, not as acknowledgement of a moment, but as recognition of something deeper, something that had always been there. And as the door closed softly behind him, the night continued, but it was no longer the same, because now, every voice in that room had learned something it would not forget, and in that quiet understanding, dignity found its place where it had always belonged. The door had already closed behind Alexander Romano, but his presence lingered in a way no one could quite explain, like the echo of a note that refused to fade. And as the evening stretched into its later hours, the restaurant settled into a quieter rhythm, not slower, but more intentional, as if every movement now carried a trace of awareness that had not existed before, and Nia felt it in the smallest details. In the way customers now spoke directly to her instead of past her, in the way their voices softened just slightly, not out of pity, but out of respect. And even in the kitchen, where noise and urgency usually swallowed everything else, there was a subtle shift, a glance, a pause, a moment where her presence was acknowledged without words, and she moved through it all with a calm she had never known in this place. Her steps steady, her voice clear, no longer shaped by hesitation, because something inside her had settled into place. Something she had been holding together for so long, without realizing it was even breaking. And behind the counter, Charles remained unusually quiet, his earlier confidence replaced with a careful distance, as though he were still trying to find the right way to exist in a room that now reflected his actions back at him. And once, just once, their eyes met across the space, and for a brief second, there was something unspoken there, not an apology, not quite, but an awareness, a recognition that something had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and he looked away first, returning to his tasks with a focus that felt almost deliberate, as if he were trying to rebuild something piece by piece, not for others, but for himself. And Nia did not react, did not hold the moment. She simply continued, because sometimes the most powerful response is not in what is said, but in what is no longer needed to be said. And as the final tables were cleared and the last guests began to leave, the soft hum of conversation fading into the quiet clink of dishes being stacked and silverware being sorted, the restaurant transformed once more, not back into what it had been, but into something new, something quieter, more grounded. And when Nia finally stepped into the break area, the weight of the night settling gently over her shoulders, she leaned back against the wall for just a second, closing her eyes, not in exhaustion, but in reflection, replaying the moment not with pain, but with clarity, because now she could see it differently, not as a point of humiliation, but as a turning point, a line where something shifted from being taken to being recognized. And when she opened her eyes again, there was no doubt in them, no question about her place in that space. And as she returned to finish her shift, there was a quiet confidence in the way she moved. Not loud, not demanding, but present. And outside, beyond the glass windows, the city continued as it always did. Cars passing, lights flickering, people moving from one place to another, unaware of the small moment that had changed something inside those walls. Because not all change announces itself. Not all impact echoes beyond the room where it begins. But for those who witness it, for those who feel it, it becomes something lasting, something that reshapes how they see, how they speak, how they listen. And though Alexander Romano was already gone, his absence now part of the night, the effect of his presence remained, woven into every quiet interaction, every measured word, every moment where someone chose to listen instead of laugh. And in that quiet transformation, something undeniable had taken root, something that would not be undone, because once dignity is seen clearly, it does not disappear again. It stays steady and unshaken in the spaces where it was once overlooked. Morning came quietly, slipping through the tall windows of the restaurant with a pale golden light that softened everything it touched, and for a moment, before the doors opened and the world rushed back in, the space felt almost untouched, as if the night before had been a story whispered rather than lived. But traces remained, not in the furniture or the polished floors, but in the people who stepped back inside, carrying with them the memory of something that had shifted, and Nia felt it the second she walked through the door. The familiar scent of coffee and polished wood greeting her, yet something beneath it felt different, not new, but clearer. And as she tied her apron and stepped into the main floor, the early staff already moving with quiet efficiency, there was no tension in her shoulders, no hesitation in her steps, just a calm presence that settled into place as naturally as breathing. And across the room, Charles stood behind the counter, reviewing the morning setup, his posture straighter than usual, his movements precise, and when he noticed her, there was a brief pause. A moment where the weight of the previous night seemed to hover between them, unspoken but undeniable, and then, without performance, without the edge that once defined his tone, he nodded, simple, direct. "Good morning, Nia," he said, his voice even, and it was not the words themselves that mattered, it was how they were said, without mockery, without assumption, just acknowledgement. And Nia returned the nod just as simply. "Good morning," her voice steady, unguarded, not louder, not altered, just hers, and that small exchange, barely noticeable to anyone else, marked something far greater than any dramatic moment could have, because it showed that change had not been temporary. It had settled into the structure of the place, into the way people chose to show up, and as the first customers of the day began to arrive, the restaurant slowly filled again with the gentle rhythm of conversation and movement, but this time, there was an awareness woven into it, a subtle understanding that had not been there before. And when Nia approached her first table, she did not brace herself, did not prepare for correction or judgment. She simply spoke, and the words carried clearly, confidently, landing exactly as they were meant to, and the man seated there listened, nodded, responded without interruption, without dismissal, and it was such a simple interaction, so ordinary on the surface. Yet it held a quiet significance that only she could fully feel, because it was not just about being heard. It was about no longer expecting not to be. And as the morning continued, the restaurant found its rhythm once more, but it was a different rhythm, one shaped not by habit, but by choice, by the quiet decision to treat each voice with the weight it deserved. And though Alexander Romano was nowhere to be seen, no trace of him in the daylight, his impact lingered in a way that did not need his presence to remain. It lived in the pause before someone spoke, in the care behind each word, in the absence of careless laughter, and as Nia moved through the space, her voice steady, her presence grounded, one truth settled deeper with each passing moment, not as a realization, but as something she had always known, now finally reflected back to her by the world around her. That dignity does not ask for permission, it does not wait to be granted, it exists, constant and unshaken, and sometimes, all it takes is one moment, one voice choosing to listen, for everyone else to finally hear it too. By midday, the restaurant no longer felt like a place recovering from something. It felt like a place that had learned, and that difference, though invisible, carried weight in every interaction, in every exchanged glance, in every word spoken with intention rather than habit. And Nia moved through it all with a quiet steadiness that no longer came from effort, but from certainty, her voice no longer shaped by caution, but by presence. And as she approached a table near the center of the room, a group of well-dressed guests paused their conversation to look up at her, not impatiently, not dismissively, but attentively. And when she spoke, there was no interruption, no correction, just listening, genuine and complete. And she noticed it, not with surprise, but with recognition, as if the world had finally aligned with something she had always known. And behind the counter, Charles continued his work with a focus that had become consistent, not forced, not performative, but intentional. And once, as he handed her a completed ticket, his voice remained steady. "Table 6 is ready," he said, meeting her eyes briefly. And this time, there was no hesitation in that moment, no discomfort, just clarity, and she nodded, taking the plate without a word, because some acknowledgments do not need to be spoken twice. And across the room, a new server, someone who had started only a week ago, watched quietly, observing the flow, the tone, the way people interacted, and in that observation, something was being passed along, not as instruction, but as example, because culture is not taught through rules, it is shaped through moments, through choices, through the way people decide to treat one another when no one is forcing them to. And as the afternoon light shifted slightly, casting longer reflections across the polished floor, the restaurant held a kind of balance that had not existed before, a balance between professionalism and humanity, between efficiency and respect, and Nia felt it most in the absence of tension, in the way her breath no longer caught before speaking, in the way her voice carried naturally, without adjustment, without apology. And as she placed another order down, a man at the table smiled and said, "Thank you. You explained that perfectly." And the words were simple, ordinary, yet they landed with a quiet significance, not because of what they said, but because of what they did not question. And for a brief second, Nia allowed herself to hold that moment, not as validation, but as confirmation. And then she moved on, because she no longer needed to stay there. She no longer needed to prove anything. And near the entrance, the door opened, letting in a brief rush of city noise before closing again. And though it was not him, though Alexander Romano did not return, there was still a subtle awareness each time that door moved, as if the memory of his presence had become part of the space itself, woven into the rhythm of the place. And as the hours passed, that awareness did not fade. It settled, becoming quieter, deeper, less about the moment that created it, and more about the way it continued to shape everything that followed. And in that quiet continuity, something became clear, not just to Nia, but to everyone who had been there, that respect, once recognized, does not need to be enforced. It sustains itself, it grows in the spaces where it is honored, and it transforms the ordinary into something meaningful. And as the day carried on, the restaurant did not return to what it had been, because it had become something better, something that understood, without needing to be reminded, that every voice, when truly heard, carries its own undeniable strength. As the sun began to lower beyond the city skyline, casting long amber streaks through the restaurant windows, the day settled into its final rhythm, quieter now, more reflective, and Nia stood for a moment near the edge of the floor, watching the space that had once felt so heavy now move with an ease she had never known before, not because the place had changed, but because something within it had been revealed, something that had always been there but had gone unseen. And as she adjusted her apron, her movements calm, deliberate, she caught her reflection faintly in the polished glass of a nearby panel, and for a second, she paused, not out of doubt, but recognition, because the person looking back at her was not different, not transformed, but clearer, as if the noise that once surrounded her had finally quieted enough for her to see herself without distortion. And behind her, the soft hum of conversation continued, steady and respectful, no longer sharp with careless laughter, no longer filled with the kind of disregard that had once defined the room. And at the counter, Charles worked with the same measured focus he had carried all day, his presence no longer imposing, no longer careless, but aware, and though no words were exchanged between them in that moment, there was no tension either, just a shared understanding that something had shifted and would not return to what it had been. And as the final guests began to leave, offering quiet thanks and polite nods, the restaurant slowly emptied, leaving behind the gentle sounds of closing, chairs being adjusted, glasses being gathered, the soft rhythm of a place winding down after a day that had carried more meaning than most. And Nia moved through it all with a calm that no longer needed to be protected. Her voice steady even in the simplest exchanges, her presence no longer something that could be overlooked, not because it demanded attention, but because it carried its own weight without effort. And as she reached the door at the end of her shift, her hand resting lightly against the cool metal handle, she hesitated for just a second, looking back into the room, not with longing, not with uncertainty, but with quiet acknowledgement, because she understood now that what had happened was not just a moment, not just an interruption in the ordinary flow of things. It was a reminder, a reflection of something that had always been true, that dignity does not arrive from outside. It does not depend on who is watching or who chooses to speak. It exists, constant and unshaken, waiting only to be recognized. And as she stepped out into the evening air, the city alive with movement and light, there was no need to look back again, because what she carried with her was not the memory of being heard, but the certainty that she had always been worth listening to. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of that restaurant, in the spaces between words and silence, that truth remained, not as a lesson spoken aloud, but as something felt, something understood, something that would stay long after the night had ended. Because in the end, it was never about who had the loudest voice, but about who chose to listen. And that day, the world inside that room remembered exactly what dignity sounds like.